The night Seraphina Weston finally understood her marriage, she was standing in the middle of a ballroom, in her finest dress, watching her husband laugh with people who had never once asked her name. She did not cry. She had stopped crying somewhere around the 14-month mark, when she realized that tears required an audience, and no one in that house was watching. She picked up a glass of champagne from a passing tray, turned toward the nearest window, and looked out at the snow falling over Halifax Harbor, and she thought, I could simply stop. Not stop living, stop performing. The thought arrived with the particular quietness of things that have been true for a long time before you find the words for them. Seraphina had married Edmund Hartwell in the spring of 1889, 3 weeks after her 23rd birthday, and 6 weeks after her father's business partner had sat across from her father in the study and explained, very gently, that the Weston trading concern was not going to survive the next quarter without a significant injection of capital. Her father had not asked her directly. That was the thing people never quite understood when she told this story later. He had not arranged it behind her back, either. He had simply come to find her in the garden one evening, sat beside her on the stone bench where she used to read as a child, and said, Edmund Hartwell has asked to call. She had looked at him for a long moment. Is the company very bad? She asked. It is not good, her father said. That was all. She had understood the rest. Edmund Hartwell was 31, heir to a shipping fortune that had grown considerably since his father's death, and possessed of the kind of precise, contained manner that some people mistook for coldness and others mistook for dignity. He was not an unkind man. That was what Seraphina told herself during the engagement, and it was true, as far as it went. He opened carriage doors. He remembered that she took her tea without sugar. He did not make her feel, in those first months of calling and dinners and careful conversation, that she was being evaluated. Exactly. Only that he was a man who moved through the world with a great deal of deliberation, and that she was one of the things he had deliberated about and decided upon. She had told herself that was enough. The wedding was held on a Thursday in May. Her dress was ivory silk. The church smelled of lilacs. Edmund had looked at her when she came down the aisle with an expression she could not quite read, something that might have been approval, or relief, or simply recognition. And she had smiled at him because that was what one did, and because part of her had still believed, in the way young women are trained to believe against all evidence, that something would shift once the thing was done. Nothing shifted. The house on Barrington Street was large and well appointed, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the Halifax winters. Edmund worked long hours at the shipping offices, and came home to dinner at 7, and they sat across from each other, at the long dining table, and spoke about the weather, about the news, about the social engagements they were expected to attend. He was not rude to her. He was not dismissive. He was simply elsewhere. Even when he was in the room, some essential part of him had not come home. His mother, Mrs. Hartwell, called every Tuesday, and sat in the front parlor, drinking tea and making observations about the household, with the particular brand of gentleness that is actually the most efficient delivery system for criticism. She said things like, I notice you've changed the arrangement of the books, dear, in a tone that made it clear she was not complimenting Seraphina's initiative. She said things like, Edmund was always so particular about the morning room, as though Seraphina's presence in it was itself a kind of trespass. Edmund did not correct her. He was not present for most of these conversations, which was, Seraphina eventually understood, not coincidental. In the evenings, after dinner, he would retire to his study, and she would sit in the sitting room with her embroidery, or her book, and the house would settle around them like a held breath, and she would listen to the clock on the mantel and think about how strange it was to be lonely in a house, with another person in it. She had written to her sister Rosalind. No, she had written to her sister Cecily, in Montreal in the first few months. Cheerful letters about the house and the garden and the harbor view. She had not written anything true until a cold November evening, when she had sat down at her writing desk, and found that her hand simply would not form the acceptable sentences, and she had written instead, I think I made a mistake, not in the way you're thinking. I think the mistake was believing that proximity would eventually become something else. It doesn't. It just stays proximity. She had not sent that letter. She had folded it into quarters and put it in the back of her writing desk, behind the extra nibs. The turning point. The first one, the one she didn't recognize as a turning point until much later, came in January of the second year, when the furnace in the east wing of the house failed, and she spent the better part of a morning figuring out that the problem was actually a cracked fitting in the line, not the furnace itself, and had found and hired a plumber to fix it before Edmund even knew there was a problem. He came home that evening to a functioning house and looked mildly surprised when she mentioned it at dinner. "You handled that," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment with something she couldn't quite name. Not quite approval, not quite reassessment. Something that hadn't quite decided what it was yet, and then he said, "Thank you," and went back to his soup. It was such a small thing. She had not done it to impress him. She had done it because she was cold, and the repairman her husband's household manager would have called wasn't available until Friday, and she had simply found a solution. But sitting there with his quiet thank you still in the air between them, she had understood something. The house was full of problems he either didn't see or didn't attend to, and she had the time, and increasingly the inclination, to do something about it. It was not a grand decision. It arrived the way most of the real decisions in her life had arrived. Quietly, through the back door, while she was looking at something else. She started with the house. Not in any dramatic way. She reorganized the pantry, which had been stocked with a logic she could not follow and which resulted in things being purchased twice and other things running out entirely. She spoke with the cook, Mrs. Dunmore, a capable woman who had been quietly managing an inefficient system for years and was visibly relieved to be asked her opinion. She went through the household accounts, which Edmund left to a manager who was adequate but not particularly attentive, and found 3 recurring expenses that were either unnecessary or being duplicated. Edmund noticed some of this. He did not comment on it, but she occasionally caught him in a room that had been quietly improved and saw his eyes move over it with a recognition that something was different, better, without quite identifying what had changed. She told herself she wasn't doing it for him. Mostly, she believed it. By the spring, she had turned her attention to the small tenement properties her father-in-law had left mixed into the estate. A row of 4 houses on Gottingen Street, that the estate manager handled with a benign neglect that had allowed the roofs to deteriorate, and the tenants, mostly fishing families, to simply manage around the problems, rather than report them. She learned about this by accident, through a conversation with the fishmonger's wife at the market, and she had stood there on the cobblestones in the April rain and felt something sharpen inside her. She went to see the houses herself, which was not what was done, and the tenants had received her with the kind of careful politeness people use when they don't know what to do with a woman in good clothes appearing at their door unannounced. She had asked careful questions and listened carefully to the answers, and she had gone home and written a very detailed letter to the estate manager with a list of specific repairs ordered by urgency. The estate manager, a Mr. Aldous Prentice, had written back with the kind of reply that manages to be polite and dismissive simultaneously, which was when she had taken the list directly to Edmund. He had been sitting at his desk. She had placed the letter in front of him without preamble and said, "The roofs on Gottingen Street will not survive another winter. The cost of repairing them now is approximately a quarter of what it will cost to replace them in 2 years. I would like to authorize the repairs." He had looked at the letter. He had looked at her. Something had moved behind his eyes, not warmth, not quite, but something that might have been the first precondition of it. "All right," he had said. She had nodded and left the room. She had walked to the end of the hallway and stood there for a moment with her hand against the wall, and she had not been entirely sure what she was feeling. The dinner party was in the autumn of the 2nd year. Edmund's business associates and their wives, 12 people arranged around the dining table, and Seraphina had managed the evening with the quiet efficiency that had become her particular signature. The right flowers, the right wine. The conversation steered with such skill that most people did not notice it was being steered at all. She had gone to the kitchen at one point and did not come back for several minutes because one of the serving dishes had been left on the wrong burner and she needed to assess whether the sauce could be salvaged. It could. And when she came back, Edmund had been in conversation with Dr. Carew and his wife, and she had heard the tail end of something that stopped her in the doorway. "Capable enough, I suppose," Edmund was saying. "Though I confess I sometimes wonder if I've given her too much latitude. She has ideas about everything." She had not been able to see his face. She had been able to see the expressions of Dr. Carew and his wife. The slight discomfort, the polite nowhere-to-look quality of people who are hearing something said out loud that perhaps should not have been said. She had stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds. Then she had smiled at the room generally, taken her seat, and asked Mrs. Carew about her daughter's upcoming debut, and spent the rest of the evening being so precisely, pleasantly present, that no one would have known anything had happened at all. But she knew. She sat with it for 2 weeks. She turned it over in her mind the way you probe a bruise. Carefully, repeatedly, to understand the exact shape of what was hurt. Ideas about everything. She had reorganized his household and found him $800 in unnecessary expenditure in the first year alone. She had repaired the roofs that his estate manager had ignored. She had managed his dinner parties and his social calendar, and his mother's Tuesday visits with a consistency and grace that had materially improved his standing in Halifax society, because she was good at these things, had always been good at these things, and she had done all of it inside a marriage in which she was apparently a woman with too many ideas. She had not expected gratitude exactly. She had not expected to be celebrated. She had thought, perhaps naively, that she had at least seen. That night after the guests had gone, and Edmund had retired, and the house was quiet, she sat in the kitchen. Not the drawing room, not the sitting room, the kitchen. Because it was the room in the house that felt most genuinely useful, and she made herself a cup of tea and sat with the specific stillness of someone making a decision. She was not going to leave. That was not in the cards. Not in 1890, not with her father's business still dependent on the stability the marriage provided, not with the shape of her choices being what they were. She understood this clearly. She was not a woman given to pretending the world was other than it was. But she was done performing, not done working. She was not the kind of person who stopped working, but done performing the warmth and the hope and the gentle reaching toward that she had been doing since May of 1889. Done setting the table of her own heart for a guest who had never actually arrived. She was going to be exactly what she was, in this house, in this life. She was going to do the things she was good at because she was good at them and they needed doing. She was going to stop waiting for him to notice in the way she had been hoping he would notice. She was going to stop leaving doors ajar. She drank her tea, she washed the cup, she went to bed. The change in her was not dramatic. Edmund did not notice it immediately, which was in some ways the point. She was still present at dinner, still managed the house with the same quiet competence, still attended the social functions, and said the right things to the right people. She was still, to any outside observer, entirely his wife. But she had stopped turning toward him. The small reaching gestures, the extra attention to his preferences, the careful reading of his moods, the openings she had been leaving in conversation, all of that stopped. Not in anger. Anger would have been noticed. In a kind of equanimity so thorough it was almost its own form of departure. His mother continued her Tuesday visits. Seraphina received her with the same courtesy, and a steadily increasing imperviousness to the small cuts, which seemed to frustrate Mrs. Hartwell more than any open response would have. Seraphina joined the Halifax Ladies' the Charitable Society in November, which gave her legitimate occasion to be out of the house 3 afternoons a week, and brought her into contact with women who had their own views about things, and were not afraid to say them in each other's company. She found she breathed differently in those rooms. She found she laughed more easily. She was careful not to think too hard about what that meant. It was in the winter of the 3rd year that she met Catherine Aldhouse. Mrs. Aldhouse was the wife of a maritime lawyer, and had been widowed, remarried, and was something of an anomaly in Halifax society, being both entirely acceptable by the standards of the day and entirely uninterested in those standards' opinions of her. She was 42, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, and she had looked at Seraphina across a committee table at the Charitable Society and said, very directly, "You're Edmund Hartwell's wife, aren't you? You don't seem much like what I'd expected." "What had you expected?" Seraphina asked. "Someone quieter," Catherine said, and smiled. They had become, gradually and then all at once, the kind of friends who say the true thing without preamble. It was Catherine who finally asked, one afternoon in Catherine's sitting room, over a very good pot of Darjeeling, "Are you happy, Seraphina?" Seraphina looked out the window at the February harbor. "I am building something," she said. "I'm not sure happiness is exactly the right word for it." Catherine had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "That's either very wise or very sad." "Probably both," Seraphina said. The night of the Merchants' Association dinner, in March of the 3rd year, was the night Edmund finally understood what he had been looking at, without seeing for 2.5 years. It was a large event, the annual dinner, the most significant social occasion of the Halifax merchant calendar. The sort of evening that built reputations or quietly damaged them, depending on how well you managed the room. Edmund had relied on Seraphina to manage these evenings before. She knew who was important, who was sensitive, who needed to be introduced to whom and in what order, which topics to steer his conversations toward, and which to quietly close down. She had always been there. It had not occurred to him to notice how much of the work she was doing. because it had not occurred to him to notice her doing it. That was the precise shape of the thing, though he could not have articulated it at the time. This year, she was not at his elbow. She was in the room. He could see her across the floor, speaking with Catherine Aldhouse and a group of women he recognized vaguely as being connected to various charitable endeavors. She was laughing. He noticed the laugh with a small shock of something he didn't immediately identify, because he realized he could not recall the last time he had heard her laugh like that. Open, unguarded, real. He stood for a moment with a glass of wine and watched her. She did not look toward him. Not once, in the time he was watching. Not with the checking glance he had grown accustomed to. Not the reaching for his approval quality that he had been dimly aware of without examining. She was simply there, fully occupied, entirely present in a space that did not include him. The evening went adequately. He managed the conversations without her. Though he made 2 errors he was aware of. Placing 2 men near each other who had a professional disagreement he had forgotten about, and missing the appropriate moment to introduce a junior associate to a senior partner in a way that would have been useful. Small things. The kind of small things that wouldn't matter once, but added up over years. He drove home in the carriage afterward, and Seraphina sat across from him in the dark, and looked out the window at the snow-lit streets. And he said, "You seemed well this evening," because it was the thing he could find to say. "I was," she said, simply, not warmly, not coldly, simply. He looked at her profile in the passing lamplight. He had married her because it was practical. He had known that. She had known it too. He was not a man who deceived himself about the nature of arrangements. He had thought it was sufficient, a shared understanding, a mutual practicality. He had thought that what he was offering, the house, the security, the position, was its own kind of consideration. He had not until this moment in a dark carriage in March 1891 understood that he had been taking something that he had not adequately considered the value of. He said nothing else. Seraphina said nothing else. The carriage pulled up to the house, and she went inside, and he stood on the step for a moment in the cold air, and he thought about the way she had laughed across that room. He began to pay attention. It was not a comfortable process. The things he started to see, once he started looking, were not flattering. The household ran with a precision and efficiency he had simply accepted as the baseline state of things, which was exactly how thoroughly she had managed it. Not because she had hidden her work, but because he had not looked. The Gottingen Street properties were in better condition than any rental property he owned elsewhere, maintained by a schedule she had apparently instituted on her own initiative, and managed through a correspondence with tradespeople he had never met. The household accounts showed 3 years of careful management, small savings accumulated into a meaningful sum, that she had reinvested into the house improvements, without ever asking for acknowledgement. He found this out not through her. She had stopped offering the information, and he had not been asking, but through the household manager, who mentioned it almost in passing, with the tone of someone mentioning a thing that is simply obvious. He sat with this for some time. He had told his colleague Reginald Carew, at some point in the 2nd year, that his wife had too many ideas. He remembered saying it. He had said it in the casual shorthand of men who talk about their wives the way they talk about the weather, not maliciously, not thoughtfully. He had said it, and the words had sat between him and Reginald for a moment, and then the conversation had moved on and he had not thought about it again. He thought about it now. He tried to imagine what it would have looked like to her, if she had heard it. The door of the dining room. The particular quality of realizing you are being discussed by someone you had perhaps hoped saw you clearly. He did not know if she had heard. He found he was afraid to ask, because asking would require acknowledging the thing he was only beginning to understand about himself, which was that he had been, for 2.5 years, a man in possession of something he had not taken the trouble to value. He left a book on her writing desk in April. It was a volume on estate management he had come across. Not a particularly significant gesture, but she had mentioned the Gottingen Street properties to him once, briefly, in connection with some question about drainage, and he had thought she might find it useful. He had left it without a note because he could not think of a note that was not either insufficient or excessive. She had not mentioned it at dinner. He had not asked about it. But 3 weeks later, he had come into the library to find a page in one of his own books marked with a slip of paper. Not her handwriting, but a sketch. A small diagram of a drainage solution that corresponded to a problem she had mentioned once. He recognized the paper from the volume he had left. She had not said anything. She had simply left it there. He stood in the library for a long moment looking at it. It was such a small thing. He was not entirely sure why it hit him the way it did, with the force of something much larger than a sketch on a slip of paper. Perhaps because it was the precise quality of it, the care, the attention, the responding to something he had offered in a language that was entirely her own. He had left a door ajar and she had not walked through it, exactly. She had just acknowledged it was there. He set the paper down carefully and went to find her. She was in the garden, which in April in Halifax meant she was standing in a coat, looking at the half-thawed beds with the assessing expression she brought to all things that needed working out. He came to stand beside her. She did not look at him. "Seraphina," he said. She said. "I want to ask you something and I want to ask it correctly, so you will have to forgive me if I take a moment." She looked at him then. Not warmly. She was not warm with him anymore, and he understood that this was not sulking or punishment. It was simply the truth of things as they had become, but with a quality of attention that was entirely her own, the particular way she had of actually listening, rather than waiting for her turn to speak. "I said something," he said, "about you, to Reginald Carew, at the dinner 2 years ago. I don't know if you heard it." She was quiet for a moment. "I heard it," she said. He nodded. He had expected this. He had prepared something, but now that he was here the prepared thing felt inadequate. So he set it aside and said simply, "I was wrong. Not wrong in the small way of saying something impolite. Wrong in the way of not understanding what I was talking about. And I've been trying to work out how to tell you that for 2 months, and I'm not sure this is the right way, but I've decided that there isn't a right way, and that waiting for one is just another kind of not saying it." Seraphina looked at him for a long moment. He could not read her expression. He had never been particularly good at reading her expression, which was one of many things he was beginning to understand he had not properly attended to. "Edmund," she said finally. "Yes. Do you know why the roofs on Gottingen Street needed replacing?" He blinked. It was not what he had expected. The estate manager. The estate manager had reports about those roofs for 3 years, before I found them at the bottom of a filing drawer and asked someone who actually knew about roofs to look at them. She paused. "I'm not telling you that to make a point about the estate manager." "What point are you making?" "That I have spent 3 years in this house attending to things. Not because I was asked. Not because I wanted recognition. Because I am someone who attends to things, and this is the life I have, and I thought I might as well make it worth attending to." She looked back at the garden. "What I stopped being able to do was pretend that was a partnership." The word landed between them in the April air, small and exact. "I don't know how to be a partner," he said. It cost him something to say it. Not pride, exactly, but the specific difficulty of a man who has organized his interior life around competence and self-sufficiency, saying plainly that he is lacking in something. "I know that," she said. "I knew that in the first month. Did that make it better or worse?" She was quiet for a moment. "Both," she said, "at different times." He turned toward her then, fully, the way he rarely turned toward anything that required him to be uncertain. "I would like to try," he said. "If that is still something you're willing to consider." She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze and did not look away, because this was the thing he could do. This, at least, the stillness of facing something directly. "Edmund," she said, "you once told a man at your own dinner table that I had too many ideas. Yes, I want you to understand that the ideas are not going away." Something shifted in his chest, not comfortable, but real, like the first thaw of a very long winter. "I would not ask them to," he said. It was not a transformation. It was not a story with a before and after where the line was clean. He was still a man of considerable reserve, given to deliberation over expression, more comfortable in the language of action than the language of feeling. He did not suddenly become the kind of husband who spoke easily about the thing inside him. But he came home earlier. He asked questions about the charitable society, and listened to the answers with what Seraphina came, slowly, to recognize as genuine attention. The particular quality of his listening when he was actually there. He stopped leaving the household accounts entirely to the manager, and began sitting with her once a month to go through them, which was uncomfortable for both of them at first, and then, gradually, something that resembled a conversation. He did not tell her he had been wrong again. He had said it once, clearly, and she understood that for Edmund Hartwell, once was not a small thing. What he did instead was show her, in the careful accumulated way of someone who has decided to do something and is going about doing it without announcement. Mrs. Hartwell came on a Tuesday in May, and made a remark about the garden, that it was ambitious, for a woman without much experience of Halifax soil, and Edmund, who was home early for the first time on a Tuesday in 3 years, said, without looking up from his paper, Seraphina has considerably more experience with this garden than either of us." The silence was brief and pointed. Mrs. Hartwell had moved to another subject. Seraphina had said nothing. But that evening, after his mother had gone, and they were sitting in the drawing room in the long May light, she had said, without particular ceremony, "Thank you." He had looked at her across the room. "I should have done that some time ago," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have." She did not soften it. He did not ask her to. The merchant's summer dinner was in June. They arrived together, which was not new, and moved through the first half of the room together, which was, she introduced him to Catherine Aldhouse, which she had never done before. Catherine looked at Edmund with sharp appraisal, and said something dry and intelligent about the shipping market that made him respond with genuine interest, and Seraphina stood between them and thought, with a surprise that was not quite happiness, and not quite relief but some third thing she didn't have a word for yet. "Oh, here we are." Later in the evening, when the dancing had started and the room had loosened into something warmer and less formal, Edmund had come to find her where she was standing near the windows with Catherine, and he had said, very quietly, near her ear, "Would you like to dance?" She turned to look at him. He was not comfortable asking. She could see that. The slight stiffness, the held quality of a man doing something effortful. He met her eyes and held them and waited. She thought about the garden in April, the slip of paper, the Tuesday in May. She thought about a woman standing in a ballroom in her finest dress watching a life she was not part of. "Yes," she said. He offered his arm and she took it, and they walked onto the floor together, and it was not easy and it was not perfect, and there was still a great deal, years, maybe, of careful work ahead of them, the slow reconstruction of something that had been built on insufficient ground the first time. She knew this. She was not given to pretending the world was other than it was. But his hand was at her waist, and the music was playing, and for the first time in 3 years she was not performing presence in a room that didn't feel like it belonged to her. She was simply there. And so finally, was he.